Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We'll do a bit of intro so those that are still joining won't miss much contact. Welcome to this ongoing series of webinars. They're specifically designed for those SEA and LEA who have received a school climate transformation grant, but the content is certainly applicable to anyone trying to develop a multi-tiered system of support, whether it's at the state level, district, or even individual school level. We basically generate ideas and topics based on what you tell us are areas of interest. And so I've been asked to talk a little bit about our work in building district-wide multi-tiered systems of support. I'm Tim Lewis. I'm a professor at the University of Missouri in special education. I'm also one of 4 co-directors of the National Center for Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. And you can see that web link on the title page there. In addition, I would encourage you to check out our state website. There's lots of additional good information around building MTSS systems of support. So I would like to make this as informal as possible, given I'm sitting yet again in my home office talking to my computer, but I do see that there are people out there. So the chat is functional. If you've got a question or a comment, please go ahead and put that in the chat. If you're a participant and somebody asks a question and you've got an answer or an example, please contribute that as well. We always learn, I think, equally as much from each other as we do from the content that we're going to be talking about. All of this will be posted on pbis.org. In addition, these webinars are recorded. It takes a while for them to clean it up and post it, but this webinar will be available. So if you have colleagues who couldn't make it, which includes a fair number of school folks, given it is a school day, feel free to send on that URL. Okay, let's jump right into it. Oh, I should also kind of pre-correct and apologize. I managed to pick up one of the various strains of flu or cold that are going around. So I'm a bit foggy, a bit congested, and so I just apologize for that up front. If you've ever heard me give a presentation or a talk, or even just informally, about how we build good systems of support for high-risk children and youth, you have seen me present with this slide, or you've heard me basically make these comments. I point out, and again, it's always good to kind of remind ourselves of this, that I can't make kids learn or behave. No one on these webinar series can make kids learn, nor can we make kids behave. The good news is we can create environments that increase the likelihood. So if we think about someone struggling to learn to read, and I ask teachers what they would do, they basically tell me they would put more and more supports in the environment to increase the likelihood that little guy, little gal learns to read. We want to think about the parallel on that social, emotional, behavioral side as well. What supports can we put in the environment to increase the likelihood? Now, one of the reasons that we've shifted our focus into district-wide supports is that it's very, very difficult, for individual schools to have all of the capacity within a single building to address some of those challenges. And then finally, what we've known from multiple years of research now, environments that increase the likelihood are guided by a core curriculum and implement with consistency and fidelity, meaning we need to be on the same page. Meaning, if we're going to implement a practice, we've got to make sure that we've got the systemic supports to help that practice be implemented by a series of educators, as I said, with fidelity. I can't tell you the number of times where I've heard somebody make a comment about, oh, that doesn't work. And then we check the fidelity. It's like, well, you're not implementing it to fidelity. So how do you know it doesn't work? We can only say it does or doesn't work for certain individuals once we have that implementation fidelity addressed. So regardless of what you call it, again, I'm from the Center for Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, so we talk a lot about school-wide PBIS. In addition, MTSS, MTBF, whatever it is that you call it, It's a framework. It is not a package. It's not a program. It's not a curriculum. We know that any package program will fall short for a group of students. So what we've done is try to move away from, we certainly incorporate evidence-based practices, and we certainly use a lot of good programs and curricula that are out there. But we work with district leadership teams. We work with state leadership teams to, in essence, to teach them how to address their own challenges. We want to make sure we are good consumers. We want to make sure that if we're going to ask our colleagues to implement something, there's strong empirical evidence that said, yep, if you put this in place, you follow the directions, you'll see impact for the majority of kids. And then we layer in more and more supports based on how students are responding or not responding to the supports that we put in that environment. Because I can't make them learn or behave, but I can build environments to increase the likelihood. So a couple of figures that I'm sure you have probably seen in the past. This is the basic, problem-solving logic. Typically, when people want to know what's the latest, greatest, what practices do we put in place? And we always say, okay, before we recommend practices, we've got to look at your data. What are your unique challenges? How widespread are those challenges? Is it a lot of students, or is it a small group of students, or a handful of students? Equally important, if we're going to put a practice in place, we're going to spend valuable minutes to make sure we're putting that in place with Fidelity. We want to also use data to progress monitor. So data guide and drive what practices we select, and data help us progress monitor to either tweak, change, or in some cases abandon ineffective practices. And then the third piece, the most critical, how do we support each other? How do we support the adults that we're tasking in our schools to put those evidence-based practices in place? That's that problem-solving logic. That's what we mean by a PBIS mtss framework. Now, the other figure you've probably seen as well is this idea of a continuum. Now, one of the unintended consequences we had is people started thinking about this as a new classification system, meaning we've got red kids, yellow kids, and green kids. We don't have red kids, yellow kids, and green kids. We have students who, under certain contexts, might need additional supports, i.e., some of those tier 2 or small group, and a small handful of kids will need those highly individualized intensive. Key and critical is that they're all linked. Key and critical is that this guides our behavior, not kid behavior. In other words, what do we do as educators? What can we put in that environment to increase the likelihood? How can we tailor that environment to help increase the likelihood students are more successful? The state of Colorado did a kind of a retool, if you will, over the past 3 years with their MTSS, RTI, PBIS, and all of the various 3 and 4 letter acronyms that we're using when we talk about social emotional behavioral supports, as well as academic and learning. And they came up with this definition that I really like in thinking about what PBIS, what MTSS is all about. It's prevention-based framework. It's team-driven. It's using data. We're looking at improving outcomes for all students through, and again, a wide expanse here, family, school, and community partners. So I just offer that up because I think that it was a very, very deliberative and careful process. And I like how comprehensive this brief definition is about what we do in our work. So if we think about that continuum, we start with universals. Universals mean all settings, all staff, all students. Key features there, we ask educators, what are your problems? And for each problem, not student names, for each problem we say, well, what do you want them to do instead? And you can't tell us stop, don't quit. We want to build a social, emotional, behavioral scope and sequence, focusing on those critical skills students need to be successful. And in response to some of the challenges that might be unique, there are some common ones across all schools: disrespect, noncompliance. We see that everywhere. But we want to make sure it's still tailored. We also want to spend lots of time and energy to be careful and deliberative about conversations, making sure that those expectations we define are also culturally relevant and culturally contextualized. Meaning, yes, we might expect kids to behave, quote unquote, this way. We might expect students to show respect this way. that might not be same or similar to some of our students and family and community. So as you think about those common expectations, make sure you also have that somewhat difficult and challenging conversation to ensure that we're getting lots of voices within them. We teach and practice, and we teach and practice some more. We teach and practice all school year long. We teach math all year long. We teach science all year long. We also need to be teaching social, emotional, behavioral expectations all year long. Now, having said that, I have seen schools make the mistake of continuing to teach as if it was an acquisition challenge, meaning kids don't know what to do. Right? When you get about grade 5, grade 6, grade 7, they'll tell you, it's like, seriously, we're going to practice walking down the hall one more time? Seriously? We don't know what hands and feet to self mean. In other words, we keep teaching as if they don't know what to do. One of the things that you also want to think about, and this is where that kind of district-wide perspective can really be beneficial and helpful, because we can tap the collective expertise versus putting all on the shoulders or all on the plate of that individual school. Making sure we're carefully paying attention to those phases of learning. We're learning a new skill, we're in acquisition. Likelihood of lots of errors. That's where we need lots of instruction, lots of support, and lots of feedback when we're getting it right, and some simple error correction when we're getting it wrong. And then we move into fluency, meaning kids start doing it, quote unquote, automatically. They're doing it more regularly. Then we move into that kind of generalization and maintenance phases. So as you think about your year-long instruction, make sure you're also paying attention. If 80, 90% of the kids are mastering the skills, move into those sort of generalization and maintenance. Move into thinking about prepping kids for that phase from elementary to middle or middle to high, high into post-secondary or career. So making sure we're paying attention to those phases of learning. We provide specific feedback. One of the big misunderstandings is that we're just handing things out so kids behave. Not it at all. Don't hand anything out if you don't want to. But in order for kids to learn mastery, we've got to give them feedback. We even rethink how we respond to problem behaviors. Yes, kids break rules. Yes, kids are so disrupt the learning environment. Remove them. I won't argue with you, but I will challenge you. What are you going to do different to decrease the likelihood it happens again? What are you going to do different to put in that environment supports to increase the likelihood they use the appropriate, quote unquote, skill versus the inappropriate skill? Once again, thinking from a district perspective, every district that we work with has a code of conduct. Yep, some of those are federally mandated in terms of safe school codes, but that doesn't prevent, or it doesn't, in essence, require you to only focus on here's the problem, here's the consequence. Think about collectively how we can respond to challenging behavior in those proactive instructional ways. So many of our schools and many of our districts are moving away, for example, for out-of-school suspension. So a large urban school district I work with, the superintendent came out and basically said, principals, you are no longer allowed to suspend any child in K through third grade. They're still learning. They're still trying to figure school out. And if we're trying to suspend kids, or if we're suspending kids at that age, those kids need to be in those chairs more than anybody else. So we're moving into more in-school suspension. And it's not just parking kids in a room. You've done the crime, you owe the time, but rather using that opportunity to teach and practice the skills that got them sent there. The importance of data, and we'll loop back to that as we talk about specific district applications, and then engaging our families, engaging our communities. So many of you probably already have your matrix. Don't create the matrix and then carve it in stone. This should be revisited annually. You're going to have new staff. You're going to have new students. You might have new challenges. The pandemic taught us that a whole lot of these things went out the window, and we had to, the word of what was it, 2021, 2022, pivot, and think about, well, what does this look like for kids online? What does this look like in a hybrid model? So making sure that you revisit this at least annually. So there's an elementary, here's a high school example. High schools tend to be less busy, fewer skills. Makes sense. Kids are getting older, kids are maturing, kids are taking more responsibility for managing themselves. Again, any questions, comments, throw them in the chat. I've got it open and I will absolutely monitor them. At tier 2, then, key here is sooner rather than later. And apologize, I should have done a pre-correct as well. This is probably review for many of you, but I think it's important to kind of at least establish some of those essential critical features, because as we move into the district, we'll kind of come back to some of these pieces. Key here at tier 2 is sooner rather than later. We want to identify kids at the first sign of quote unquote non-response to our universals. So we need a quick way to identify. What most of our school districts are doing are creating data decision rules. And the data decision rule might vary school by school, and that's okay, because each school needs to reflect that decision rule in response to their challenging behavior. When I sit down with a school team or I sit down with a district team, I basically create a rule saying, okay, let's say it's 2 major infractions in a quarter. Now let's look at the kids. Are there any kids below that cut line that you have concerns about, that you think should be considered for possible tier 2 supports? And if people say, yeah, there's a whole bunch here, then we maybe adjust our decision rule. If people say, nope, that's looking like it's captured it pretty well. The other bit of advice that I give my schools and districts is create the rule and go with it. You will know within a month, you will know within a quarter, whether or not it's catching enough kids, whether or not you set it too high, too low. So don't overthink it. Just eyeball and draw a line and say, here's our rule. And if it floods our system, then we'll adjust it. If we're not catching enough kids, then we'll adjust it. Many of our districts are moving to screening. And I know screening is challenging for a lot of our districts in terms of parent pushback, in terms of local and state new laws about parent say in any measure schools collect. But I still think it's worthwhile investing. We've got lots of information on PBIS.org about different ways to screen. Screening also concerns people because they think, oh, we're going to catch a bunch of kids and we got to serve them. Screening doesn't require you to serve them. Screening just says, hey, take a look. You should never move a student right into intervention from a screening data point. A screening data point is just a moment in time when typically an adult, sometimes the students themselves, says this kid's a little bit different than the kid sitting next to them. It just simply requires us as educators to let's bring that young person to the table. Let's have a conversation. And then as always, have a teacher referral. Teachers continue to be the best test, especially when we're looking at more internalizing challenges. Kids who are anxious, kids who are withdrawn, kids who are depressed. We typically catch those kids in our discipline data as well, but oftentimes they can fly under the radar for a long time. So sooner rather than later, create decision rules. District, think about a district-wide screening. Think about a common teacher referral form or process. Then we just do a simple match, right? And we basically limit within our districts, at least as a starting point, to think about just these 3 tier 2. You can always add more, but for some kids, we just need additional instruction. They just need more practice. They might need more examples around specific challenges, such as managing themselves, such as getting along with others, and so forth. Second is self-management. So we do a lot of check and check out, check, connect, and expect, check and connect at the secondary. So again, these are lots of good evidence-based programs, but that's not our sum total of what we do to support social, emotional, behavioral needs. There are lots of good social skill curriculum out there, both in social emotional learning, as well as traditional sort of behavioral challenges, as well as social interaction skills. And then the third area is academics. Kids oftentimes will come to our attention around challenging behavior, but we start scratching and drilling down. It's an academic issue. They're 2-3 grade levels below. Makes sense they're acting out to avoid and escape that challenging task. And then as you see in bright, bright red letters, it has to be linked to universal. Tier 3, when tier 2 is not sufficient. In other words, they're not responding. Or when problem behavior is intense and chronic. No, you don't have to move every student through tier 2 before tier 3. If you've got some intense issues, move right to tier 3. We're being instructional based. We are educators first and foremost. So we're driven by that functional behavioral assessment, trying to figure out what triggers this kid and what maintains that challenging behavior. They typically can tell you what they're supposed to do. And even our most challenging kids, we see them doing the quote unquote right thing all the time. But under certain predictable situations, they opt to choose and go with some of the problem behavior. Now, you see connections to mental health and community agencies here. This is definitely where it's typically seen. But we're also seeing, and we can talk about this as we go, seeing the need even at tier 1. So as a district, again, this is the great logic of having a district-wide initiative as opposed to a single school. The district can start thinking about how you use your mental health supports, how you use your counselors or your social workers or your school psychologists, folks with that mental health expertise, tapping that expertise to help figure out how you can push in some of those good supports, even at tier 1 as a prevention, even within tier 2. We've got schools using check in, check out, for example, a simple self-monitoring. Kids walk around the school day and they rate themselves, and then the teacher gives them feedback. It's typically focused on those expectations. We're having schools add some of those key components of some of the cognitive behavioral interventions they're using for kids who are anxious or depressed, such as, did I refrain? Did I ask for help? So thinking about mental health here is traditional, but I'd also encourage you to push it in across the continuum. So that's the quick review. Hopefully it's very, very familiar. Here's the challenge. First, I oftentimes ask people in the district, put your hand up if you own tier 2, and very few hands go up. Now it's changing a bit in that some of our districts are hiring MTSS coordinators. And so their hand logically and naturally goes up. But in most typical schools, nobody owns it. Somebody volunteers to coordinate it. Sometimes it's our teaching staff, sometimes it's our counselor. But when those folks go or they get busy, oftentimes our tier 2 system disappears. Second point, I have yet to set foot in a single school that has enough behavioral expertise to build the entire continuum independent of any external supports, especially when you get to tier 3. Tier 3 almost by definition requires district, in some sense, regional or state supports. This is where we're tapping our school psychologists and our special educators and other folks who've got expertise in social emotional behavioral functioning and learning. So one of the things that we're doing is trying to figure out how we distribute that expertise in meaningful ways. Tier 2, Tier 3 is going to require ongoing professional development and technical assistance. We used to do lots of workshops. We do tier 1 workshop, we do tier 2, and then tier 3. We've sort of moved away from that in a lot of the states that we work in. And that once you get to tier 2, it becomes pretty individualized, meaning their data indicate these are supports that they need to put in place. In addition, just the reality of today in school, nobody has the luxury of 4 or 5 professional days that they can send teachers off, and knowing full well, we've got plenty of subs to cover those vacancies. So we moved away from kind of those long, day-long workshops and rather distributing the supports in small bites. So meeting with the team, having them do some virtual modules, having them do a little bit of reading. And then when we meet with them, it's more action planning and problem solving. Well, we quickly get out-resourced and outpaced. And part of the logic of these school climate transformation grants is helping LEAs and SEAs helping us LEAs as well build capacity within. And then finally, most of our behavior supports is still case by case. It's a very inefficient system, especially over the past 2 years, where all of the data that I'm seeing, kids are overwhelming the system, right? We used to expect about 5 to 7% of kids on IEPs. We're looking at 10, 15 now. We used to expect 10 to 20% of kids needing mental health supports. I've seen articles pointing upwards of 70 to 80% of the school population. Educators are saying these kids could benefit for some mental health supports. So we've got to rethink how we distribute that behavioral and mental health supports. The traditional delivery model is inefficient and is not working, especially in the post-pandemic. And all signs point we're going to continue to challenge with critical shortages. both in terms of our teaching staff, but as well as our mental health staff. I was working with a district, and this was a pretty affluent district, and they were talking about, they had a young person severely clinically depressed, and they reached out to a community agency and said, yep, we can absolutely assess him. We'll see him in 18 months. It was a 1.5 year waiting list just to get an assessment. And I'm hearing that story frequently repeated. So once again, what we have been really focusing on, probably for the past decade in our work, is moving from school by school. There's just too many of you. You outpace and out-resource, but rather focusing in on building district capacity. The district has resources. Every district has mental health supports. Every district has specialized instruction around disability and risk. Every district can access those things, whether it's within district or through an intermediate. I know many of your states have education service districts or intermediate education facilities. That expertise is there. The challenge is it still continues to be kind of doled out case by case. What we want to encourage you to do is to think about tapping that expertise and distributing it on a wider scale. So it's going to require that the district identifies core academic plus differentiated instruction. It's going to require that the district identify core social, emotional, behavioral skills, plus a way to differentiate. Differentiating is that continuum. So what does it look like in universal, tier 2, tier 3? And then alignment across the systems. Even in intermediate-sized districts, there might be 15, 20 schools. They'll oftentimes hand me a teacher referral form, and I'll talk to the counselors and school psychologists, oftentimes who are split between buildings, and they report everybody uses it differently. Nobody follows the same process or steps. And a lot of my social workers in particular, who cover many schools, have to sort of walk in and say, okay, this school, okay, they do it this way. Here's the form. Here's what they call their team. Here are the steps. All right, now I can move forward and try to assist in building that. Other things, it's going to require us to align resources. So our good colleagues and friends, Steve Goodman and Rob Horner, put together a great article, and I stole this slide from them, thinking about aligning those different initiatives within our district. Many of you have probably gone through that work smarter, not harder exercise we oftentimes do, where we have you list all of the committees and all the initiatives, who's on it and what the outcomes are and how they're measured, and basically crossing some off that don't have clear outcomes and combining many others. So one of the things that Steve and Rob talk about is these are critical things you got to pay attention to. First are funding requirements. So if you are an LEA that has a school climate transformation grant, you just recently reported in on your GEPRA measures. You are required to report on certain measures. You're required to have certain features in place, making sure we pay attention to that. Mandatory program requirements. So these are things that in essence, federal law, state law that require us to do, such as the special education process. And then thinking about critical features that define it and ways to measure that fidelity. Remember, I talked about that importance of fidelity. You can't make kids behave or learn, but we can build environments. And environments implemented with high fidelity increase that likelihood. So the folks in Michigan put together this really nice worksheet. And you can access this at their website. In essence, the district initiative, the purpose, outcomes, and then those critical questions. Is this mandated? Is this required by state or federal or through funding, right? We've got these 3 grants. These grants require us to implement these practices and or collect these data. So thinking about first steps, you've got probably lots of things going on in your district. How do we sit down and kind of organize those pieces and make sure we're not duplicating, and equally important, make sure we're not competing. And I see that competing a lot, and especially in a lot of the larger districts that we work with. They're so vast and there's so many things going on. People within that initiative don't talk to other folks. So making sure at minimum, we've got an understanding of how all of these things sort of fit together, kind of doing that crosswalk. So when we go in and work with our districts, here's kind of the basic steps that we say, we're going to work with you. And I should also sort of pre-correct here. We know that it takes schools anywhere from 18 months to 5 years to implement just tier 1 with Fidelity. We're telling districts to think in 10-year timeframes, think in a decade. We've got some evidence to show that we're pushing into that 10-year to truly have a comprehensive, functioning district-wide initiative. And that district-wide initiative is also able to be flexible enough. So any new initiative, any new requirements from your state department or from the federal government, you're able to sort of fold those into what you're already doing. So here's what we tell districts. First, let each school adapt and adopt their own set of expectations. So schools like to have fun with acronyms, or they use their school mascot or their colors. Let them do that. It's okay that your different elementaries have different expectations than their feeder middle. It makes sense, and a lot of districts and a lot of individual schools come to the same conclusion about, well, let's have some commonalities so it's less of a transition for our kids. But don't necessarily mandate that. Let each building own their tier 1. Now, at the district, though, the responsibility is to make sure they've got ongoing professional learning and technical assistance. You're going to have turnover. You're going to have new administration. So that continual need to ensure tier 1 implement Fidelity exists. Now, here's where we differ. So each school can have a bit of flexibility around universals, but when it comes to tier 2 and tier 3, what we recommend is you build a district-wide tier 2, tier 3 system, such that each individual building doesn't have to invent it on their own. Schools that basically put the entire continuum in place, they will tell you it took a lot of time and energy. It took those key folks who were dedicated and took a lot of things out of their hide to make that happen. We also know that schools that we've worked with, the entire continuum, gold star schools, 2-3 people key to that process leave, and it disappears in a month. We don't want that to happen. We want to make sure whatever you build outlives everybody on this webinar. So we develop a district-wide tier 2, tier 3 process. Now, yes, there's individualization, particularly like around the data decision rules. I talked about that earlier, but the district agrees, here are the data that everybody's going to collect. In addition to having some commonalities around the data, to help schools make decisions, it also helps us at the district level to make decisions about what our individual schools need. And then a percentage of your behavioral expertise is got to move from case by case into that tier 2, tier 3. So what we do is we pull together what we call the build team. If anybody's a Mythbuster fan, he'll know that term, where after the success of the show, the stars kind of did a few things, and then they had some young folks they called the build team. They're the ones that build all of the scenarios to test that myth. So the build team is typically, we've got school counselors, school psychologists, teachers, maybe some administrators, and they are tasked to design that district's tier 2, tier 3 system. Now, at the end, I've got a lot of resources and a couple links that will take you to some districts where you can actually see their tier 2, tier 3 process. You can see their quote unquote guidebook or their tier 2, tier 3 manual and their systems. So there are lots of good examples that are out there. So we support universals, make sure everybody's implementing Fidelity. We allow some individualization, but at tier 2, tier 3, it becomes kind of a standard district-wide process. The other thing I should say is I work in a lot of states, Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana, Alaska, very, very rural, very, very far away from a lot of resources. Those areas are rethinking even the district. And so what we've done, for example, in Nebraska, one of the education service units got one of these grants, and they're serving as kind of the de facto district. In other words, they're helping them develop a region-wide tier 2, tier 3 process. So each of those very small K-12 districts don't have to do it on their own, because for the most part, they rely heavily on a lot of those social emotional behavioral supports from that ESU. So even think regionally, if in a small kind of rural district, you've probably seen this figure. This comes from our implementation blueprint. And this is basically those essential features of the leadership team. The leadership team at the district has two simultaneous functions. They have executive functions and they have implementation functions. Most people are familiar with the implementation. That's the training, the coaching, and evaluating, and that continual implementation. Equally important to pay attention to those executive, because this is going to require the district to step up and do these things, such as engaging stakeholders, your school board, your parents, your community, your business relationships. At the district level, funding and alignment are key and critical. All decisions, right, come into the district. The dollars come there. And for the most part, decisions are made there. Policy, codifying this, making it, this is how we do business in our district. And that workforce capacity, you hire at the district level, making sure the administrators, the teachers, the paraprofessionals, the support staff are at least familiar with MTSS. They may not have worked in a school that was implementing, but they at least understand it. And they understand that it's an expectation. If I come work in your school district, I'm going to be part of this district-wide MTSS process. So I showed you this problem-solving process before at the school level. Thinking about at the district level, we need to look at data across all our schools. We need to think in terms of practices and building a district-wide Tier 2 and Tier 3 process. And then our systems, we need to rethink how we support behavior. Typically, it's case by case. Our districts that are doing great things and being successful, they're freeing up some of those folks' time to actually work with school teams and build capacity. You know, the story I share along that line is I still get calls from schools saying, Tim, we got this kid, I've got this teacher really struggling. Can you come help this teacher with this kid? And I always say, no, I won't come and help that teacher with that kid, but I'd be happy to come and meet with a school team and teach them what I would do to help that teacher and that student. Because I know that kid came to the point where that principal picked up the phone and gave me a call. There are 9 more just like him or her waiting to be that kid. And if we continue to just focus on, well, we're just doing case by case and kids have got to meet certain rules and so forth and certain decisions, and before we can have a conversation. Somebody put in a question. Yes, absolutely. You'll get a copy of the slides and the recording. All this will be posted on pbis.org. So give our web folks a bit of time, but yes, it will absolutely be available. So we're thinking the same problem-solving logic, but we're doing it now at a district level as opposed to an individual school level. So basically the region district Tier 2 system, we create that kind of day decision rules, we limit a range of practice, and for our systems, we're going to use a new tool we developed about 3-4 years ago now called the District System Fidelity Inventory. There's also district capacity assessment and other tools out there to help you action plan and problem solve. So the basic steps, first thing we do is we always start with data. We sit down and at minimum, excuse me, we look at individual school self-assessment, we look at schools' fidelity implementation, and we look at student outcomes. If we're impacting, we want to keep doing that. If we're not reaching groups of kids or large swaths of kids, we need to rethink what we're doing. We designate that build team. We identify readiness criteria at the individual school to move into Tier 2 or Tier 3, and then we outline the process. We identify practices. Again, I'm going to show you an example in a second, and we're going to limit the number. We then have got to provide professional development for teams as well as for our coaches. Worked in a district, fairly mid-sized district, and they had lots of behavioral resources. And what we quickly found was, just like every other facet of humanity, people have different skill sets. So some are great at standing in front of a room and teaching others. Some are horrified and no way, no how. I don't want anything to stand up and do professional development. But that person is a master at sitting down with a team and walking them through the problem-solving process. So we had to provide ongoing coaching, and I'll give you some links to some of our resources that we're developing, including self-assessments. So we're building capacity within that district. We're taking our counselors and our school psychs and others, and even some of our administration staff, and we're giving them the skills to work with those building teams to implement best practice. So some examples. This is a district, it's a number of years ago now, but one of the things we did is we compared Fidelity to self-assessment. So the TFI is the Tiered Fidelity Inventory. That's a measure to what degree schools are implementing essential features of positive behavioral intervention supports at Tier 1, 2, and 3. The self-assessment survey is distributed school-wide. It's anonymous. Everybody completes it. And it's my perception of what degree that's in place. And what you see here is at the top part there, you've got lots of schools saying, yep, we're doing Tier 1 on the Fidelity tool. But then when we ask their colleagues, they're like, what are you talking about? I'm not seeing this. It's not in place. And so this allows us, in essence, to tailor and shape our professional learning and technical assistance. So for that first group of schools, it's oftentimes communication. So a lot of these schools, I said, okay, look at your staff. How many are new over the past 3 years? Wow, a third of them. Have you ever done some overview? Have you made sure you've partnered all your new teachers with a master teacher in case they've got questions about your MTSS system? No, we haven't done that. So that might be all they need to do, is to do a little bit more in-house communication. We've got some schools that have got nothing in place. We've got schools like down there at the bottom that are rock stars, got everything in place. So the other thing that we're doing in terms of our professional learning, I'm not seeing anything available. I'm assuming the question there is about the slides. You are correct. They're not there yet. We always post the slides with the recording. So this will be post this session. I will forward the slides and see if our web person can get them up ASAP. So what it allows us to do is to tailor our technical assistance and our professional learning. So we don't just put all the elementaries together, excuse me, and then our secondary together. We group schools when we have an opportunity to bring them together based on their level of implementation. We make sure that folks providing the technical assistance to those individual schools are aware of where they are in their level of implementation. Again, apologize. We also look at what the challenges are. So this is district-wide behavior at the end of the year. We're still getting lots of inappropriate language and defiance and some physical aggression. Good news is, in terms of some of the drugs, in terms of some of the tardies, boy, they've really just fallen off the chart. We look at time of day. So again, this is district-wide. So this has implications for our district in terms of supervision, in terms of support around those timeframes. We break it down by ethnicity, making sure that we are attempting to achieve equitable outcomes for all groups of kids. So what you see in terms of percent of enrolled students and percent of total referrals, in this case, we've got some issues for our Black, African-American, as well as Latina in this district, and that we're referring more than we would expect. So we look at fidelity data, we look at assessment data, and we look at kid outcome. And when we have this in front of us, and every year this district, at the end of the year, they pull the data together. They do this great thing called a data dig, where they share the data with individual schools and have them add to their action plans, as well as they look at this district-wide, and then they take those individual school action plans and continue to sort of feed into their district-wide initiative. In terms of practices, we limit and match the need. So this is a page from Millard School District in Omaha, Nebraska, who put together a Tier 2, Tier 3 MTSS guidebook. And again, I think we've got the link. In fact, I know we have the link on the page that I'll share with you in a minute here. And what that build team did is basically, you see at the top there, listed the different practices: check in, check out, academic instruction, self-monitoring, breaks are better. So these are some of the things they already had in place. And they matched them to possible function, helping schools process and think about, wow, yeah, this kid's doing it to escape tasks. Well, then check in, check out is probably not what you want to do. If they're doing it to escape tasks, it makes sense to maybe add some social skills, to maybe add some academic instructional supports, and so forth. So they built this based on their district challenges. They also poured through lots of published social skill curriculum. And remember, they had the data. So they knew what the challenges all the schools were facing across the district. So instead of saying, oh yeah, pick up this curriculum, start on page 1 and go through page 400, they basically broke it out based on challenges. So you see the skills focus on, you see the age range, and you see some of the categories within intervention. So what they've done is they've done the heavy lifting. So if I'm in a middle school and we've got a group of kids that are meeting the decision rule for tier 2 supports, and we're looking at that function, we're looking at patterns, we said, oh, we should do some small group social skills. We don't have to chase it down. It's already developed for us. All we need to do is reach out to our coach and say, hey, can you come help meet at our leadership team and help us set up a small group social skill for this group of kids? And we're interested in some of the lessons from skill streaming and second step. We think that will meet and match our challenges nicely. So that build team has done kind of the heavy lifting. Once again, schools are still free to add and do different things. But what it does, it allows me as that building administrator to not have to chase down professional development, to not have to chase down technical assistance. It's right there in my own district. I just need to know who I need to reach out to for supports. And I also know the expectations of me within my school, that we need to make readiness factor, that we need to make sure we've got tier 1 with Fidelity before we go down this path in terms of tier 2 or tier 3. So at the systems level, once again, thinking about these leadership team functions, we built a tool around each of these. And in essence, if you're familiar with the tiered fidelity inventory, where the team sits down, goes through items, and you give yourself a score, and there are a range of stems around how you would score, that we then translate that into an action plan. So the DSFI is available to download. You go to pbis.org. You can even just put in the search box DSFI. I've got a couple pages I'll share with you in a second. The other thing we need to do is we need to rethink technical assistance. So we've got to move from a case-by-case where the expert comes and develops a plan, where now we have the expert come and build expertise within our team and within our building. The primary focus is always on teaching the team to solve their own challenges. Yes, it's a fair request. I'm going to need help. If I'm that MTSS team leader, we're going to need help putting this in place and monitoring it and thinking about all the moving parts. That's a fair question. But I also know it's there in my district. I just need to reach out. And finally, sometimes when I talk about district, our school psychs and others get a little nervous. Our SPED directors are quick to point out, you know, we've got this federal law. And remember, I'm a special educator, keenly aware. We will always need specialists. And we will always need to follow those individual procedural safeguards and afford due process to our families. So yes, specialists, we're not putting you out of job. It'd be great if we could put you out of job, wouldn't it? If we could build enough capacity that we didn't, you know, I've got great job security, unfortunately, and probably many of you on this webinar do as well. But we're rethinking kind of that case by case, put the fire out to let's sit down with a team and teach them. You know, I point out as a special educator, I have no secret skills. I have no special magic. I just have a set of skills that I've learned that I can teach anybody. You know, I point out, instead of teaching social studies, I elected to teach social skills, and I can teach those to anybody. So building that capacity, thinking strategically at the district level to anticipate, based on our own data, where schools are going to hit hotspots. Now, there are always kids that throw us for a loop, but those tend to be the exceptions. For the most part, if you're thinking about the schools you work in, it's pretty familiar challenges. The other piece that we need to make sure we think about as a district is that as a district, you will go through these phases of implementation, and within your own district, each school will also go through phase implementation. So I showed you that comparison of fidelity score versus self-assessment score and how some schools have nothing. They're in that exploration adaptation. Other schools have got everything, They're in that continuous improvement. They're in that, okay, how do we create efficiencies? How do we continue to build capacity? How do we make sure when that crackerjack assistant principal that's been running this now gets a principal job at another school, that we've got the supports and resources where that person, yes, they'll be missed, but our work will continue on. So there's a whole lot of moving parts to think about at the district. You need to think about what level of implementation based on the data each of your individual schools are. You need to then think about tailoring your professional development and, equally important, if not more important, your technical assistance to increase the likelihood each of your schools can be successful. So within a lot of our instruments, this one here is the PD blueprint, the professional development blueprint. We actually have a trainer coach assessment. And so what we'll do in our districts is we'll have each of the quote unquote coaches. So our coaches tend to be our school psychologists, our counselors, sometimes our assistant principals, people with some degrees of freedom in their day, whereby they can help that and focus and work with the school team and not just solely individual students. In other words, it's difficult for teachers to do this because they've got kind of those 6-hour teaching responsibilities across the day. But this is also, as I said, all of these resources you will be able to access. It's a Google sheet that basically once I put in my data, it produces this nice graph to show where I feel that I've got confidence in these skill sets. And these are some areas that I could probably do a little more work in. Action planning is key and critical. That's something that, as I said, is the whole point of going through this process. So this is one of the elements of the district system fidelity inventory. Main idea, thinking about short term, what are we going to do the rest of the school year? What do we want in the next 3 years? And then what do we want it to be in the next decade? We align the action plan with our DSFI. Now, as I said, there are other tools out there as well. Some of you might be using the district capacity assessment, and there's the URL to access that. If you just Google district capacity assessment, it will take you to NERN. This is a really nice tool that's been around for a long time, but it's kind of initiative free. So this is a nice tool if you're thinking about adding the academic pieces, for example. So all of our tools in PBIS, obviously based on the name of the center, are focused more on social emotional behavioral. So this might be something you want to take a look at as well if you're thinking about kind of both sides of that triangle. A final thought before I move into resources and quick questions. I love this quote. This quote comes from business consultant who works with corporations. And he points out all organizations and systems are designed intentionally or unwittingly to achieve precisely the results they get. So if we're not reaching segments of kids, if we are getting overwhelmed by the need, which pretty much every district that I'm working with is feeling that pressure. As I said, this post-pandemic, the pandemic's still here. It has had profound and far-reaching impact, not just academically, but socially, emotionally, behavioral as well. I talked about how the mental health needs and kids so many years behind are overwhelming our traditional system. It's time to kind of rethink. So things that you'll be able to access, if you want to, I'll leave this up for a couple seconds here. You've got the QR code. We've got a Google sheet, and the Google sheet basically just has a bunch of hot links to a lot of resources that we've developed at the National Center as well as at my center here in Missouri that you will be able to click and download. You can also search for all of these at pbis.org or pbismissouri.org. And once again, these slides will be posted. So within that, that Google sheet, we've got the DSFI. We've got a simple tool that we developed called the Item Rating Tracker. So some of our districts are now implementing 5, 6, 7 years. They use this kind of to compare year by year. And it's an efficient way to kind of input the data and basically maintain and keep track of all that as you go. So once again, these are just simply pages from the DSFI. Also in that sheet where you can click is an action plan template. In addition, we at Missouri have developed a district implementation guidebook. So for every item on the DSFI, the District System Fidelity Inventory, we have definitions, we have examples, we have recommendations. So in other words, if you score low on an item, take a look at the guidebook. You might be able to pull an example from another district, or you might be able to kind of walk through some of the worksheets we have in there to lead you to an implementable action item. Other things, we also have a slide deck to train on each of the areas around the DSFI. So if we've got any SEA, state folks, these would be great tools for you to use. Even within the district, you might take a look at this. The DSFI is best implemented by that team with an outside person. And all of our states and territories have a partner at PBIS.org. You can just go and click on Getting in My State. So if you are a district, reach out to your state. If you're a state, reach out to us, and we can help facilitate and set up some of that training. Other things, we've got kind of the logic, sort of what I talked about in this hour. We've got a nice new product about drilling down. So that very quick snapshot that I just walked you through, comparing, for example, the Fidelity to the self-assessment and student outcomes, this guide helps you kind of walk through that logic. Other things we have in there, we've got a new District 3 guide level and collecting Fidelity data to help support and sustain. So all of those moving parts, data, practice, system. In addition, as I said, you'll have a link to Millard School District. I showed you a couple pages from their Tier 2, Tier 3. Ferguson Florissant School District here in the St. Louis area has also been doing some great work. And they've been very gracious about posting. So you can access all of their mtss framework, their guides, their tools, and adaptations they've made for their district. So I've been monitoring Q&A and chat. We had a couple questions in Q&A, mostly sort of about slides and access. Are there any final questions before we bring this to an end? I don't think the webinar allows you to unmute. So if you just quickly type into the chat, and or you're all looking at the clock saying, no, I've got an 11 o'clock or a 12 o'clock or 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock, depending on what time zone you're in, that I need to run to. All right, I'm going to take that as, even in my muddled state, that it was just so crystal clear you've got no questions, and that you're just all eager and itching to jump off this webinar and get started. Once again, these will be posted. The recorded webinar, as I said, it takes a bit for them to, download it, process it, convert it such that it's accessible for folks to download from PBIS.org. Go to the School Climate Transformation Grant area. That's where you'll find this webinar, as well as dozens of others around a lot of related topics. Well, thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. All right. Hearing nothing else, we're going to call this a day. So thank you all very much for attending. And you will also probably receive a link for some feedback. So please, we're continually trying to improve these. We know, again, everybody's kind of Zoom fatigued, but if you've got suggestions, ideas, we are all ears and eager to learn. Thank you, everybody.